I'm sure you've probably noticed that most of us tend to have very fond memories in our mind of whatever the specific time period was when we came of age. And the older we get, the more we tend to look back on that time period as the good old days, right? For me, I'm a child of the 80s. So I was born in 1973, which means I was coming of age in the 80s. Most of my teenage years were in the 80s, and I would argue with you to my last breath that the 80s were the coolest decade that has ever been and ever will be. Everything about the 80s was cool. I'm sorry, it just was. The 80s had the coolest music. The 80s had the coolest movies. I had a white jacket and a pink t-shirt, because we all wanted to look like Don Johnson, and we all wanted to be Miami Vice. Mullets were cool in the 80s, and that was okay. Bangs up to here with half a can of hairspray in them were okay, and were beautiful. The 80s were great, and you probably feel that same way about whatever time frame it was when you came of age. And so I want us just to do a little experiment together. I know you've been standing up a lot, but stand up with me one more time this morning. We're going to do a little test. This is really simple. You don't have to do anything other than this. I'm going to read through some things in history from each a decade at a time. And all you have to do is when I get to a decade that you don't remember, sit down. All right? So some of you young ones will get to sit down right off, because I'm going to start with the 2000s, 2000 to 2010. All right? So if you remember this, remain standing. You remember 9/11, the invention of TiVo, the emergence of reality TV. Boy, wasn't life grand before that. The emergence of reality TV, the tsunami in Indonesia, and Hurricane Katrina. If you remember those things, remain standing. If you don't, sit down. All right, the 1990s. Remain standing if you remember the Beanie Baby craze. The emergence of grunge music. The first Gulf War. The fall of the Soviet Union, Michael Jordan winning 6 NBA titles, the Bill Clinton scandal, and the O.J. Simpson trial. If you remember all of that, stay standing. We lost a few. All right, moving on to the best decade, the 80s. Remain standing if you remember the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. If you remember when Ronald Reagan was shot, when the Atari 2600 was the coolest gaming console on the planet, when yuppies was a common term, and when Miami Vice and Dukes of Hazzard were must-see TV. Stay standing. Dukes of Hazzard's on Amazon, and it's still awesome. I watched a couple episodes a couple weeks ago. All right, the 1970s, stay standing if you can remember 8-track tapes, platform shoes, leisure suits, Nixon's resignation, Darth Vader's first appearance on screen, the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War, and the death of Elvis. If you remember those things, stay standing. That's where I tap out. I was born in 73, but I was too little. I don't remember any of those things except Darth Vader. All right. Boy, the herd is starting to thin. The 60s, stay standing if you remember. Lava lamps. Woodstock. JFK's assassination. That's one of those things, if you were alive, you remember. The Beatles coming to America. The Civil Rights Movement. Roger Maris hitting 61 homers, and when Star Trek first went on the air. All right. The 1950s. Stay standing if you remember when Sputnik first orbited the Earth. When Alaska and Hawaii became states. That's a while. If you remember when there wasn't 50 stars on our flag. When rock and roll entered the mainstream, the Korean War, and television took the nation by storm. There's a few hardy souls. If you remember the 50s, you've gone from no TV to streaming television on a phone in your pocket. You have seen a little bit in your lifetime. All right, let's see if I can get rid of the rest of you. The 40s. Stay standing if you remember Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Hiroshima, and the end of Hiroshima, I always say that wrong, and the end of World War II. All right, I think I finally weeded everybody out. Those people that were standing at the end, by the way, they deserve a big hand. Because if you've been alive that long, you have seen some stuff in your lifetime. You have seen world wars. You've seen world leaders come and go. You've seen communism rise and fall. If you've lived that long, you have experienced your share of heartache, and you've had friendships come and go, and you know what difficulty is in a way that a young person can't possibly imagine. And here's what I want you to think about this morning, whether you're 25 or 75. Can you remember a time in your life before life started to beat you up, and before life started to knock you down, before you started to become cynical? Can you remember what it was like to be a kid? And I'm not saying do you remember when you were a kid, but do you remember what it was like to be a kid? Do you remember what it was like to be young when all of life was still in front of you and everything is possible? You remember that when you were young and idealistic and you could dream of playing in the NFL, and it wasn't an unrealistic goal, right? When you dreamed of being a princess or marrying Prince Charming or being the president or whatever it was you dreamed about when a kid, and when you were a kid, it was all possible. And I think we tend to look back on that period in our childhood when we come of age, and the older we get, the worse we tend to be about this. We look back at that period as the good old days, when the reality is those days weren't any better than today. They really weren't. In a lot of cases, they were worse. But most of the times, the good old days weren't really the good old days. The biggest difference is that in what we view as the good old days, we were just young and idealistic, and we still knew what it was to dream. And most of us, we tend to lose that along the way. I see so many people who age poorly, that they reached, and Billy Graham said when he was in his 90s, getting old is not for sissies, and he was right. You live to be 90, and there's just nothing easy about anything. But I see so many people who they age poorly in the sense that they may live to be in their 70s or their 80s or 90s, but they reach a point in life where just everything about the whole world stinks. And they can't see anything good about anything anymore because life has just knocked it out of them, the ability to even see it. It starts with a lot of guys my age. I'm 46, and guys my age tend to have somewhere along the way a midlife crisis, right? Where you just lose your mind. For whatever reason, you make a totally irrational purchase, you do something totally stupid. I think that happens a lot of times because we reach a point in life, the older we get, where we reach a point where we realize my dreams aren't going to come true. And life hasn't worked out the way that I thought it would. Or, even worse, all of our dreams do come true. And we discover that we're still not happy. And so we begin to scramble as we get older and try harder, looking harder for that elusive thing that's going to make it all make sense. But somewhere in the back of our mind, there's always this question that's dogging us and haunting us that something's just not right. Things are not the way they are supposed to be. And the reason we feel that way is because that feeling is absolutely true. Things in this world are not the way they are supposed to be. And the heartache and the pain and all that we experience every day is not the way God designed for this life to be. And I say all that this morning to say this. We come in our text in John chapter 3 today to a man who's probably a middle-aged man or a little bit older, and I think he has reached that point in life where he has accomplished everything he set out to accomplish, and something is still missing. His name was Nicodemus, but I doubt anybody called him that. I'm fairly certain everybody called him Nick. And we're going to call him Nick today because really, nobody ever is going to call you by your full name, right? I'm Timothy, and I like Timothy, but I gave up years ago. Nobody's ever going to call me that. So I'll just settle for Tim, just don't call me Timmy, and we'll get it wrong, right? And so I imagine Nicodemus was that way. All of his friends called him Nick, but he hated Nicky. And so Nick's a middle-aged man. And by every measurable standard, he should have been happy. If religion makes you happy, he should have been one of the happiest people on the face of the planet. As we're told that Nicodemus was a Pharisee. The Pharisees were probably the most religious people on the face of planet Earth at the time. And a very devoted and very select group. We tend to think of the Pharisees as this big group of people because they get a lot of press in the pages of the New Testament. But scholars estimate there was probably never more than 5,000 or 6,000 Pharisees in all of Israel at any one point in time. Because it was hard to be a Pharisee. They were the religious elite of the religious elite. They were serious about the Bible, and they were serious about taking God's word, following God's word. So they took all of God's commands in the Bible and all of God's laws, and then they added a bunch more rules to keep those rules, and rules to keep those rules, and rules to keep those rules. Hundreds and hundreds of rules that they tried with all of their might to follow. And so if being religious made you happy, Nicodemus should have been happy. So he was religious. Not only was he religious, he was influential, he was successful, and he was powerful. We're told that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish ruling body. It'd be kind of similar if you took our Supreme Court and our Congress and you combined them into one body. That's kind of what the Sanhedrin was for the Jews. And they were under Roman occupation in the first century, but the Romans gave them a lot of latitude in being able to rule themselves as long as they paid their taxes. And so Nick was a part of that body, the most prestigious body in all of Israel. And so that means people looked up to him. And when he walked into a room, people valued his opinion. And when he spoke, people listened. And if being important and prestigious and successful in your career field and having people look up to you, if that made you happy, he should have been happy because he had that. Not only did he have that, he likely was fairly wealthy because of that position in the Sanhedrin. He would have had a very easy lifestyle, as comfortable as a lifestyle as you could have had in the first century. He could have had all of the luxuries money could buy. So he's successful, he's wealthy, he's religious, he's hit the trifecta. But something in the back of Nicodemus' mind was telling him something is not right. And he began to hear about this young Jewish whippersnapper who'd come into Jerusalem and kind of taken it by storm. He made headlines when he went to the temple during Passover, and he overthrew the money changers' table, and he ran them all out of the temple. And then he stayed around after for a few days, and he began teaching, and he was performing all of these miracles. And word of that got to Nicodemus, and possibly he'd even heard Jesus teach. And he began to be intrigued by this young man. And so he sneaks off to meet Jesus one night, and that's where we pick up today in John chapter 3, verse 1. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do the signs that you do unless God is with him. Now, a lot of scholars want to make a big deal out of the fact that Nicodemus came to Jesus at night. And usually the narrative goes something like this, that Nicodemus is embarrassed or Nicodemus is ashamed. And because of his position in the Sanhedrin, he doesn't want to be seen talking to Jesus or inquiring about this young Jewish rabbi. And so he sneaks over to see Jesus at night. That may have been the case, but I don't think that was the case at all. I think Nicodemus came to Jesus at night because he's sincerely seeking. And he wanted to have time to spend a significant amount of time with Jesus. His life would have been very busy during the day as a member of the Sanhedrin. And we know Jesus' life, once he began his ministry, it was wall-to-wall busy and wall-to-wall people, every day. He had to sneak out of the house at 4 a.m, and if he wanted to go off and have time to pray, because once the day started, it was just people cramming around him all of the time. And it was hard to get to him. And I think Nicodemus wanted more than, a quick handshake and a signature. He wanted the opportunity, an autograph. He wanted to be able to sit down and talk to Jesus. I think that's why he comes to him at night. Because we see he approaches Jesus with respect. He's at least a middle-aged man, maybe an older man. And yet he comes to Jesus, who's a 30-year-old man, a much younger man. And he calls him rabbi or teacher, a term of respect. And he recognizes, we know you come from God, because nobody could come from God that if they weren't from God, if they were doing the miracles that you're doing. And so I think Nicodemus is sincerely searching. He knows something's not right and something's missing. And he's going to have this fascinating conversation with Jesus. And I love how Jesus cuts immediately to the point here. And there's a lesson in Jesus' response, I think, for us in evangelism, that Jesus doesn't go off chasing a lot of, red herrings and getting off track when he could have spent time to ask, well, yeah, actually I am from God. Let me give you 5 evidences that I came from God or whatever. There's a lot of different directions they could have gone. But Jesus gets immediately to the point with Nicodemus. And he says in verse 3, Jesus answered him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus goes straight to the point. Nicodemus, glad you're here. Good to see you. Here's your problem. You need to be born again. And Nicodemus' brain explodes. Verse 4, Nicodemus said, "How can a man be born when he's old?" Fair question. Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? And what I want you to realize this morning in reading this, sometimes we suffer in this passage from overfamiliarity. That most everybody in here, we have heard the phrase born again in a religious context all of our life. People even outside of the church would recognize in context that it's a religious phrase, right? Sometimes Christians are referred to by people who aren't Christians as they're a born again Christian, right? And we use it today as a term a lot for somebody who's really either a very conservative Christian or very serious about their faith. Like you have regular Christians and born-again Christians. And that's kind of the way we use it. But so even people that aren't followers of Jesus would recognize it, even if they didn't know what it meant, they would recognize it as a religious term. But I want you to realize in our text today, this is the first time anybody has ever used this phrase in the context Jesus is using it in. So when he says, Nicodemus, you must be born again, Nicodemus doesn't have that religious framework with the phrase to think of it in that terms. So obviously his mind goes, what on earth are you talking about? What are you saying? I'm coming to you and this is your advice? I had to be born again. How on earth is that going to happen? I'm no doctor, Jesus. But I'm pretty sure I can't go back up there and start over. So what do you mean? So Nicodemus is obviously, his mind is blown right from the start. And in this conversation Jesus is going to have with them, Jesus keeps coming back to that point, by the way. He doesn't back up. He doesn't take a different approach. 4 different times Jesus says, and you'll see as we go through here, 4 different times Jesus comes back to, you have to be born again. You have to be born of God. You have to be born of the Spirit. He keeps coming back to that over and over again. And I think there's several lessons Jesus teaches us in this passage about the importance of the new birth and what it means to experience the new birth. I think the first thing this passage teaches is that you cannot inherit the new birth. You don't get the new birth by osmosis. You don't experience the new birth because your grandmama was a Christian, because she took you to vacation Bible school when you were a kid. You don't get it by being around the church. You don't get it by being around Christian people. I think sometimes even as Christians, we would all say we're saved by grace, but we struggle to live like we're saved by grace. And our tendency in the real world many times is we see somebody like Nicodemus, and we all have said, but he is such a good guy. How could he be lost? He's such a great guy, and he probably was. He tried to keep, he was more religious probably than anybody sitting in this room, and probably more moral than anybody sitting in this room today. If you got there by being good, he would have had as good a shot as anybody has ever had. And Jesus said, nope, Nick, not good enough. Doesn't matter that you're Jewish. Doesn't matter you've been raised in a religious nation. Doesn't matter you've been raised in a religious home, in a religious culture. You need to be born again. I think sometimes our true beliefs betray us if you listen to the way Christian people talk at funerals. Especially if you go to a funeral for somebody that, for all intents and purposes, I don't know, God knows a person's heart. I don't know a person's heart. But from all intents and purposes, the person was not a believer. And they never made any claim to be a believer or to follow Jesus. And listen to the way we talk. We try so hard to talk them into heaven without Jesus, because they were such swell people. And the reality is they weren't swell people. And you're not a swell person. Sitting in this church service today, this morning, does nothing to get you bonus points or merit points before a holy God. You can't inherit the new birth by rubbing up against it. You've got to be born again. Number two, this passage teaches us that just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't real. Notice how Jesus continues his conversation in verse 5. Jesus said, "Truly, truly, I say unto you, unless one is born of the water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God." Now, some people want to go back and read baptism into this passage, that you have to be baptized, you've got to be born of the water and of the Spirit. And I see no reason in the world to think that. I think the context makes it clear. Jesus doesn't have baptism in mind here. I think all he's saying when he says you got to be born of the water and the Spirit is you have a physical birth, you have to have a spiritual birth. Guys, we're fortunate enough we get to stay in the delivery room with our wives these days. And you know, when a baby is born, there's lots of fluids involved. And I think that's all Jesus is saying. You've got to be born of the water. You have a physical birth, but you also have to have a spiritual birth. And the next verse, I think, makes that clear. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, spiritual birth, or your physical birth, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Don't marvel that I said to you, you must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. We never see the wind, right? We see the effects of the wind sometimes. We feel the wind. We might see something carried along by the wind, but we don't see the wind. But that doesn't mean wind is not real, right? And I think that's what Jesus is saying here. The evidence of the new birth is not all the things sometimes that we point to as evidence. We tend to look to all the externals and go, that person must be a great Christian. That's not necessarily the case. Reality is, churches across America today are full of people who go to church every Sunday and do and say all the right things. They've never experienced the new birth. They don't know Jesus, and if they die today, they die lost. But if you have experienced the new birth, you know it, right? You know it. You can't put your finger on it, but you know when God changes your life and you experience His grace. It's kind of like back in the 1800s, and it's hard to believe. That's fairly recent, in the span of history. But as late as the middle to the late 1800s, most people, and even most doctors and people in the scientific community, still believed in spontaneous generation. And by that we mean they believed that sometimes life just sprang up out of non-life. They believed frogs just grew out of mud puddles, and that maggots just grew on dead bodies, and that diseases just grew for some inexplicable reason. You would get a disease and it would grow on your body. Until Louis Pasteur came along, and him and some of his colleagues began to teach and discover that no, actually it's impossible for life to come from non-life, and that all life comes from similar life. And he began to teach this idea that all of these things you think spontaneously generate, they're actually coming from microscopic organisms that are so small you can't see them with your eyes. And that's where disease comes from. And that blew people's mind. They just couldn't wrap their mind around it, that this disease I can see is being caused by something I can't see. And of course, we all accept that today, right? We realize that it's true that right now at this moment there are literally millions of microscopic organisms crawling all over your body, feeding on the dead skin on your arms right now as you speak. And I just said that to see how many people would reach over and scratch their arms. But it's true, they're all over you. Every breath you take in, you are breathing in thousands of tiny microscopic little organisms. There's millions more that live in your guts, and you'll never see them, but they help you with digestion, and they actually serve a purpose. All of these things, they're there all the time. That was mind-blowing in the late 1800s. And the medical community have a hard time coming to grips with that. There's probably more people, more soldiers that died in the Civil War from the treatment of their wounds than of their wounds. Because medical hospitals were just filthy, and they'd turn around and saw off a guy's leg with the saw and then turn around and use it on another guy, and they never cleaned their instruments. And there was such a high infant mortality rate and a high number of women dying in childbirth because a doctor would go from doing surgery with blood still on his hands and go in another room and deliver a baby. And Pasteur was going, dude, just wash your hands. Just clean that stuff up. But they laughed at him at first because they all could not wrap their mind around that this tiny little thing I can't see is actually what's causing all of this disease. But just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it isn't real. We need to remember that in a scientific world that tends to want to point to the scientific method as the answer for everything. And if you can't test it scientifically, you can't prove that it's true. And I hope you realize this morning the limits of science. There's a whole lots of things that science can't prove. Science can't prove philosophical truths. Science can't prove theological truths. It can't prove anything that it can't observe. And there's a whole lot that science can observe. But the fact that you don't see it doesn't mean that it's not true. By the way, the flip of that, I was talking about earlier. Sometimes that person in your life that really seems to be struggling. We judge people so much on the externals. They're a good Christian. They don't drink, curse, or smoke, or chew, or go with those who do, right? Or whatever our list of rules are. They must be a good Christian. That person that doesn't have their act together, that's limping along and having a hard time, don't be so quick to make adjustment. You don't know what God might be doing in their heart. Number 3, you can't experience the new birth without humility. Nicodemus is still struggling. Verse 9. There's still smoke coming from his ears. Nicodemus says, "How can these things be?" He's trying to wrap his mind around. So what he's here, it's blowing his mind. He's never heard anything like this before. And what we have is probably a long conversation condensed down into a few verses. And Jesus and him have been talking for a while. And he says, how on earth is this possible? And Jesus says, are you a teacher of Israel? And yet you don't understand this? You're supposed to be the religious elite, and you don't get what I'm talking about? Truly, truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know and we bear witness of what we have seen, but you don't receive our testimony. I have told you earthly things, and you do not believe. How can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? Now, I think Nicodemus is honestly searching. We know at some point Nicodemus becomes a believer. It may have been on this night. If not this night, I think it was very soon thereafter that he becomes a follower of Jesus. But at this point, he's struggling. And here's what I think he was struggling with. Nicodemus had lived his entire life up to this point in time. He's 40, 50 years old. And now Jesus has just challenged his worldview of what he has believed his entire life. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but it's a devastating experience. We all have a worldview. You know, your worldview is simply the way you come to view the world in terms of the way things operate. And we're all trying to make sense of it. And we come to believe in our minds certain things are true, and this is the way some things are, and this is the way things ought to be. And we develop our worldview, and I don't know if you've ever had this happen, where you believe something's true with all of your heart, you're convinced this is the way the world is, and you come to find out you're totally wrong. That'll mess you up a little bit. And I think that's what's happening with Nicodemus here, because he's had this worldview all of his life, that if I just try hard enough, I can please God. If I just keep the Sabbath devoutly enough, if I just keep the Old Testament Levitical law devoutly enough, and if I try and try and try and can just try hard enough, I can make it. And now Jesus is telling him, no, you can't. You've got to be born again. And so it takes some humility on Nicodemus' part to realize, I don't have my act together the way I thought I did. And that pride is probably still the single greatest thing that keeps people from experiencing the new birth today. This idea that if I just try a little bit harder, I can make it. I'm a pretty good person compared to that guy. And we can all always find that guy, right? We can always find somebody who's not as good as us, and we compare ourselves to them. I'm better than they are. I'm a pretty good person. And we can't experience the new birth until we have the humility to come before God and admit, I don't have it together. Not only do I not have it together, I am so broken that I'm hopeless unless you fix it. Which leads to number 4. And that is, you can't experience a spiritual birth through physical means. Look at what Jesus says, wrapping it up in verse 13. No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven. And Jesus is just saying there, I'm qualified to tell you heavenly things and to teach you these things because I came from heaven myself. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Now, Jesus alludes there to a really weird passage in the Old Testament. And I'm sure some of you are familiar, but for those who aren't, let me read it to you real quick. Numbers chapter 21, starting in verse 4. The children of Israel are wandering in the wilderness on their way to Canaan. They set out by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the people became impatient on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no food, there's no water, and we loathe this worthless food. Now, if you know your Old Testament, you know this was a cycle the Israelites went through periodically. God is great, we trust Him for everything. 2, we just turn our back on Him and He doesn't have a clue what He's doing. And so this is one of those down cycles where they're complaining against everything. They're complaining. God is giving them manna from heaven. They don't even have to work for it. They go out of their tent. There's food on the ground every day. And if you don't know, manna was Kit Kats without the chocolate on them. I don't have time now to go into the Hebrew, but that's basically what they were. And they were just laying there every day. And they start griping and complaining. They don't trust God to take to them. God doesn't like it much. Verse 6, the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people die. I'm really glad God is merciful most of the time, aren't you? I'm glad every time I have this same attitude, I don't wake up with a house full of snakes. But on this occasion, they did. And the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that He will take the serpents away from us. So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. Weird, right? Get a big stick, make a statue of a snake, stick it on the top of the stick. And everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, will live. So Moses made a bronze serpent, and he set it on a pole, and if the serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. I don't know if you're supposed to say the Bible's weird, but that's weird. It's just weird, right? You got an infestation of snakes, and the cure for it is just odd, right? It's not like God says, all right, here's the cure. You know, there's manna every morning. Tomorrow morning when you go to your tent, there's going to be an ointment that you rub on the snake bites. Or some sort of medicinal cure, or make a poultice with this and wrap it up in this. No, here's the cure for your snake bite. Just look at the snake on the pole. That's odd. But I think God had a good reason for it. God has a good reason for everything that He does. I think it is interesting to notice about that whole scenario that the snake on the pole was prescriptive, not preventive. That is, it was for people who were already sick, people who had already been bitten. It's also interesting that the symbol of the curse becomes the healing for the curse. Their problem was they'd been bitten by snakes. A symbol of a snake is their healing. And not only that, you know, the fall of mankind and, you know, Satan came to him as a serpent. You have that imagery there, and now that becomes the symbol for healing. And I think that's both significant because I think what God is doing here, and we see this a lot in the Old Testament, where there's a foreshadowing of better days to come. We've got the classic example, you know, Abraham goes to offer Isaac, which of course was a beautiful picture in the Old Testament, that one day the Messiah would come who would offer his son as a sacrifice. And Jesus says that's what this instance in Numbers was. That those who looked at the serpent up on the pole were saved. That all foreshadowed that one day there would be one who would come. And those who looked to Him would be saved. And just like the serpent on the pole, looking to Jesus is prescriptive, not preventive. That people who find healing in Jesus, people who experience the new birth, it's only for people who are already sick. And you can't be healed until you admit that you're sick. And just like the serpent on the pole, Jesus became the curse for us. And as He hung on the cross, God placed the weight of all of our sin on Him. And just like the serpent on the pole, the solution almost seems too simple. All you've got to do to be healed, all you have to do to experience the new birth is look up to Him. But we struggle to do that. You guys have seen the show Hoarders, right? if there's a hoarder here today, I'm not being critical. But some of those people are nasty. And I mean, it's not, you know it, if you haven't seen it, you don't know. It's not that they're just cluttery people. People, and it's a mental condition, these hoarders, that they can't get rid of anything. And everything is precious to them. And if you've seen, their houses are just full, packed to the ceiling with just garbage and filth and nastiness, and they're living in the middle of it. I'm a neat freak. My decorating style, I like Asian decorating style where nothing's out. Everything's put up or behind something. You know, all clean surfaces, nothing out. And I don't know how they live, because it's just piles of stuff. And they go in to try to help them. And it's not like they're not hoarding valuable things. They're hoarding garbage and they're hoarding junk, but they can't let go. And they go in to try to help them clean it up, and they try to start taking stuff away. And we'll go, why don't we just throw this, bent up tire rim from 30 years ago? Why don't we just get rid of this? And they can't do it. And like I said, there is a mental disorder that accompanies this. I read about one couple that in Manhattan, Kansas, they were hoarders. Their house was packed to where they couldn't get anything else in it, out on their front porch, out on their front lawn. They had like 6 broke down cars in their front yard, and they didn't drive. Washers and dryers, and their house became so full, there was not room, they couldn't live in it anymore. And rather than clean up, they bought the house next door. And so now you pull up to their house, and there's just a sign out front that says, "We've moved next door." And they're doing the same thing in that house. And I thought of that, because that's what we do with our sin. That's what keeps us from experiencing the new birth, that we grab onto it and we hold it, and it piles up and it piles up and it piles up, and it's literally our own filth is destroying us and consuming us. And we just let it pile up and pile up and pile up, and then we'll take one little sin out of all of this garbage, and we'll try to do better. I'm going to take this one little thing, and I'm going to become a better person. And so we throw this one little piece of paper away, and we think, wow, what a swell person I am. And that's really what our good works are in comparison to the weight of our sin. We do this little bit, and we think, I am so good and I am so swell, while literally the house is caving in around us. And we have a problem we can't fix on our own. We can't do it by physical means. You cannot just buck up and say, I'm going to do better and overcome your sin problem. If you want to defeat your sin problem, you just have to look to Jesus. This passage is so wonderful because this is the whole gospel. This is what makes Christianity different from every other religion on the face of the earth. Every other religion on the face of the earth says in one way or another, try harder and be a better person. Only Christianity says, you're not a good person and you know it. If you're honest in your heart, you know it. So just look to Jesus and let him heal you and do what you can't do. I'm not naive enough to think that in a crowd this size this morning, there's somebody sitting here today who you're religious as all get out. And everybody here may be convinced you're the best Christian on the face of the planet. You're fooling them and you're fooling me because you're saying and doing all the right things, but you know in your heart you've never experienced the new birth. You've never submitted to Jesus. You've never entrusted him with your life. You're trying to do it all yourself. And being religious is just making you miserable. Ain't no better day than today than to experience the new birth and find out what Nicodemus found out. If you are here today and you are a follower of Jesus, here's my encouragement to us this morning. We've been given the new birth. Revel in it. Wallow in it, in the freedom that you have been given in Jesus. Far too often, we say we're saved by grace, and then we go out and live like it's all on our works. It wasn't you to start with. It's not going to be you to finish with. So enjoy the grace and the mercy of Jesus this week. Let's pray together, Lord.